Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut. It's a pleasure to be here for this special episode in honor of the upcoming Yom Tov of Pesach. This is going to be a fascinating discussion as we discuss the cup for the visitor. What lies behind the Kos Shel Eliyahu? I'm sure everybody listening, I shouldn't be sure, but I would think everybody listening has the minig that after they bench, they fill up a kos and they open the door. And it's an exciting part of the Seder. Who's opening? Is Eliyahu Navi there? They watch the wine in the cup bubble as Eliyahu Navi comes and actually drinks the kos. So perhaps we'll learn a little bit about this. I must begin by saying that this episode has been sponsored by friends of Rav Moshe Chagiz, who is the Mechaber of Minchas Chinuch on Pesach, 2 volumes. One was put out last year. One was put out this year. I know that he just did a interview with Nachi Weinstein's Farm Chatter podcast where he discussed the Sefer and the impetus behind it. And I'm sure Rabbi Eliezer Brut, being the Sfarim addict that he is, he lets me use that word. I think he coined it himself. Probably has the Sefer and could tell us very, very briefly what the Sefer is about. And before we hit the main episode.
Yeah. So basically, Rabbi Hubner's Minchas Chinuch on Pesach, which is 2 volumes, as you mentioned so far, is like this. In 1869, one of the most famous, popular Sfarim, which was published, the Minchas Chinuch. And then for many years, different editions came out until more recently in our lifetimes, the edition of Mechon Yerushalayim, which opened up the Minchas Chinuch to even more people for its weird abbreviations. Now, I mapped out a little bit about Reb Chaim in the Shiurim on Reb Chaim Kanievsky, in the Sefer Nachal Isa, and I tied this into in general the style of the Minchas Chinuch, which we're not going to discuss now. But what is this particular work? Looking at it briefly, it's as follows: Rabbi Hubner, he's a descendant of the Minchas Chinuch. Him and his father was also a tremendous Talmid Chacham. They spent lots of time over many years learning it very carefully, and they decided to make an adaptation of some of the materials into English. And the work does as follows. First of all, it's in English. It's very clear, very crystal clear, actually. It uses charts, for example, to break down the complicated lumdus of the Minchas Chinuch, what he's famous for. It also gives you the necessary background. A lot of times, one of the things when you have to learn Minchas Chinuch, you have to look up all the various Gemaras and other Taisis in some places. He gives you all that also. It's not a simple translation. He adds tons of insight with lots of new material that they found through their own research from hundreds of Svarim. The layout is beautiful. This we have to give credit to Mechon Ali Zayed from Rabbi Shemanowitz. And basically, this makes Lumdus much more accessible in English. There's almost nothing similar currently out there. So we highly recommend this work, and we thank them, the friends of Rabbi Hubner, for sponsoring this episode of Kavod Pesach.
Okay, so let's jump right into our topic, the Kos Shel Eliyahu. What are the, brief introduction, and what are the sources you'll be using to enlighten us about the Kos Shel Eliyahu? And then I would love to hear, what are the earliest sources where the Kos Shel Eliyahu is actually mentioned? The one famous quote, I can't even recall now where I saw it, but it's, Girsa de Yankasa, right? We know the Dalat L'Shayna Shel Geula are connected to Dalat Kaisis, and then say Vevesi is the Kos Shel Eliyahu. So where does that come from? We'll also be discussing how could Eliyahu Navi be in so many places at once? Is that even a question? And so many other fascinating discussions. Let's try not to get into too many rabbit holes, regarding Kos Shel Eliyahu, and keep this episode to 45 minutes to an hour.
The idea,
Rabbi Brut, take it away.
We're trying to keep it to one episode. Okay, so here's the story. About 19 years ago, Pesach morning, a friend of mine's father comes into shul very cynically and says it can't be that there's a real source for Eliyahu Navi coming to the Seder and the Kos Shel Eliyahu and everything. He found it very hard to believe. So I took it upon myself as a challenge to check into. I'm fond of looking and exploring the origins of Minhagim. I took upon myself already immediately that the first day, I think it was the first day of Yom Tov, ready to start researching it and using my Hagadah, my vast Hagadah collection and other materials, and I started looking. The Chalamoid, I believe it was already. I headed off right away to JTS and to find materials about this topic. About 10 years ago, I published some of my findings in English and then updated it again, and the plan was to put out a Hebrew more updated article afterwards, which I wrote most of it. However, sadly, a rabbit hole. It basically became a rabbit hole, and I'm working on a small book on the topic. One of these days, I hope to publish. Okay, now the questions that we hope to at least touch on over here is: what's the earliest origin of a Kos Shel Eliyahu? When does one pour it? In the beginning of the seder? After benching? Why do we do it? Is there any connection to Shefoch Chamsocha? Is there any connection about the opening of the door with this minig? Does Eliyahu actually come? Does he drink from the kais? What happens afterwards? What happens with the kais afterwards? Do we drink from it, or do you leave it out on the table the whole night? All these types of things. So we hope to touch a little bit about everything. I'm not going to go into every single detail. As time, we are trying to keep it under a certain amount of time. As I like to always mention, I'm going to mention this very, very briefly. What sources did I use? So on Eliyahu Navi, there's endless amount of sources about him. He's such a significant player. There's so many different things. Example, let's say for a bris, which some of these questions actually are relevant. Does Eliyahu Navi really come to a bris? So that is early Makairis for. How does he go to so many brisim at the same time? And there's famous shilas on Shabbos, Tchumim, all these different questions. They relate over here, but we're not going to discuss about bris right now. Okay, now, Lamashal, there's a tefillah based on an early Kabbalistic minig. We say Pesach Eliyahu, which is just an excuse. Many Svardim say it daily, Hasidim say it weekly, others say it other times, and basically it's a piece of Zayar with Eliyahu. I believe it has a connection that Eliyahu Navi is supposed to be the author of this piece. The only reason why I'm just throwing this out there is because just now a new Ksav relating to this piece in Zecher just came to print within the less than 24 hours in the latest issue of Yeshurun. There's other books on Eliyahu Navi. There's a fellow, Daniel Matt, recently wrote a book about Eliyahu Navi, but there's so many. I'm not going to list all of them. There's various new PhDs on Eliyahu Navi that also tie into our story of Kos Shel Eliyahu. There's a fellow, Le'ar Jacoby, who's written I think he has plans to write about 6 articles, all relating somehow with aspects of Kos Shel Eliyahu. At least 2 or 3 of them were published, and I could, if someone asks for the PDFs of them, I'd be more than happy to send them out. In general, we know Minig Yisrael Tairahi, and so not only is the Minig Yisrael Tairahi, but it creates an excuse to learn a lot of Torah, and that's what hopefully we'll see today. Now, in 1958, a small little work came out on the Sugya of Kos Shel Eliyahu by a fellow, Rabbi Yehuda Avidah, a tremendous person. I'm not going to get into all the story of this person. He was a Rav in different places, and he ends up making Aliyah. And he was a prolific writer in numerous places. He wrote journals, Svarim in Yiddish, Hebrew. He's an expert in all different types of things. Somehow, the topic of Eliyahu Navi coming to the Seder fascinated him, and he put out this booklet called Kos Shel Eliyahu Navi. In general, most people that write about it, either they steal from him and don't give him credit, or they give him credit. But he basically, with tremendous bekias of that period of time, put together a lot of the materials based on sources in German, Yiddish, Hebrew, and different things, but you have to give him karas hatov for what he did for the topic. He also was an excellent writer. He writes in a certain style, but we have to judge a sefer based on the sources that he was able to see. Not every sefer was available at the time, and stuff came to light as time went on, which we'll mention along the way. Now, just one other point with him is, while I was working over 10 years ago, while I was working on the topics, I decided one time I was in a library. I didn't have my copy of Kos Shel Eliyahu of his handy. So I just decided, it was in the Bar Ilan library. I decided, let me look up something I need to see something inside. As we know, so I order up the copy that Bar Ilan has. And I see all of a sudden an entry. It says that they have the autographed copy of Rebbe Avidah with editions that were never published. I immediately get all excited. I order it up, and it comes up with a whole bunch of papers and a lot of editions. And it seems that he was planning on making a second edition, but he died beforehand. I took this as a simra shamayim, with tracking down his grandson, getting permission from Bar Ilan University, and I released this all in a volume 10 years ago with all the new editions of his on the topic, and it looks like this. Anyway, now, okay, so that's the one of the main sources, and then of course, like everything else, there's dozens of articles about it, which we're not going to cite all of them. Each one, everyone always has something useful in them. One other point of sources is there's a lot of times for such a thing, you also have to look in autobiographical materials, and we're going to see a little bit also mishumadim, people that went off when they talk about their memoirs about being Jewish, and also Christians, how they describe Yiddish minhagim. Okay, ad kan for the sources.
Okay, so now tell us, I'm this Lakewood guy. If I open up my Svarim, where am I going to find the earliest sources for Kos Shel
Okay,
Eliyahu?
so interestingly enough, it's like this. One of the very important svarim and Shulchan Aruch Bechlal is from the Knesset Hagadah. So the less known, but known, is that the Knesset Hagadah wrote a Sefer Pesach Meuven on Hilchas Pesach. It was printed after he dies in 1692. In there we find, now he's more Svardi. He writes as follows: the that people would add into their kais. Some Ashkenazim would put in the shulchan on the table, kais echad reikon, an empty kais, chutz min hakais hatzrichin for everyone else. And what the kairin oisei Kos Shel Eliyahu, they would call it a Kos Shel Eliyahu, Zecher l'Tov. And I enjoyed this minig. And what you do is you pour like a lot of time you have wine from each of the kaises, so you pour the leftover wine into this cup, and before the next cup is poured, and then at the end, we're middle of the Suda, they would drink this cup. This is what the Knesset Hagadah says. This is printed in 1692. There's no connection to Eliyahu Hanavi, but it was called Kos Shel Eliyahu Hanavi, and this was probably one of the most known early sources about it. Now, he's saying it's Ashkenazi minig. Okay. Fast forward, Mamish, in a work printed around that time in 1696 from the Chok Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reischer, he writes, "V'noyegim be'elu medinas," and he was a rav in Germany, in different places in Germany. "V'noyegim be'elu medinas limzoi kais acher yosim ha'masubin v'karinayse Kos Shel Eliyahu Hanavi." So here it's a little different. They would pour a special kais, calling it Eliyahu Hanavi, but when did they pour it? Unclear. Fine. Now, at this point, there's no connection to Shefoch Chamsocha or Eliyahu Hanavi coming to visit the Seder. Another early source is a little later, in 1728. Moshe Chagiz prints a small sefer, a Maimer and Hagim, in the back of a sefer called Berachos Eliyahu. Someone asked the question, what's pshat that they have this kais called Eliyahu Hanavi? Now here it seems interesting. They would prepare a bed that the Baal Habayis would leave it there at the end of the Seder Kinnereh, and they would leave the kais with the wine, and they would say it's L'Shem Eliyahu Hanavi. And it seems the person was asking Moshe Chagiz, is it a strange minig? Is there anything behind it, or is it a shtus? Okay. Moshe Chagiz says no, it's a vada. Do not make fun of minig Yisrael. The ke'ein Tairahi. And then he says you have to be chayker what the makar for this minig is, and he gives a reason which we'll get to Amir Tashem. So here we see a different minig. So what's going on over here? These are the earliest sources, and you're seeing different things. Now, Moshe Chagiz actually says, what about the Pesach move? And he says he doesn't know what's pshat in that minig. It's a mistake to pour the wine into the from the leftover wine and stuff to put it. It's a zilzal, and he doesn't understand what the reason is, and he does not recommend to do such a thing. Okay. A little later, Rabbi Yaakov Emden in his famous Siddur, Beis Yaakov, which ends up becoming very, very famous, says, we prepare a big kais, and we call it Eliyahu Hanavi. Here he adds in a big kais. But again, when exactly? Why? No reason given. Okay, a little later, that's 1745. 1782, we have Aaron Vermeis in his Sefer Mayriyar, a very interesting person. He says they would do it als cherus, so he wouldn't have to, that the Baal Bayis wouldn't have to pour. But then he says an interesting reason, basically, is that the kids would ask, and he would say it's for Eliyahu Hanavi, and it's sort of to avoid people that would make fun of this type of minig. So not really that Eliyahu Hanavi does come, just people would say what's it for. And so again, what's going on? We're still in the dark. What's behind this minig? We get a little further. In 1803, there's a fellow, Rabbi Yitzchak David ben Rebbe, who's a Meshulach from Yerushalayim. He puts out a sefer called Chedushay Dinim Hilchos Pesach, and he writes there, Achar Kiddush. He's referring to Minhagim of Yerushalayim for the most part. He says, Achar Kiddush, Yesh Noyegin Laniach Al Shulchan Kais Gadol Reikam, an empty kais, Chutz Min HaKais Atzrichim El HaMasubin, and you fill it up, and you drink it, middle of the Suda, V'min Kosher. This is mamish, similar to what the Knesset Hagadah brings down. You go a little further, the Shulchan Aruch Harav says, that you pour an extra cup and you call it Kos Shel Eliyahu. Again, why, when, where, it's still unclear. Chasam Sofer, we see that those that record the Minhagim Chasam Sofer, they were at the Seder and he would have a very nice cup, but here he says other people did not drink from it. Interestingly enough, in another place it says, a Talmud is made, that the Chassam Sofer would take this from the Eser Makos, when you pour the wine, he will pour this into the Kos Shel Eliyahu. Interesting. You go fast forward, we have the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. He brings down that they would pour an extra cup Kos Shel Eliyahu. But again, it's not found after Birchas Hamazon in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch Mashal. It's at the beginning of the Seder Kilo. So you basically have extra cup at the beginning of the Seder. Very strange. Okay, you look at the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan talks about it. It's also unclear exactly when it was done according to Aruch HaShulchan, and the Mishnah Berurah also brings down the minig, and he even brings a reason, which is unclear what his source for his reason was. But anyway, the point is, we're in the dark. We see a minig that they call the Kos Shel Eliyahu. Why it's being called Kos Shel Eliyahu, when it's exactly being poured, unclear, and what exactly how it works. Okay, now just to conclude this part is that I mentioned there's autobiographical information always that's very helpful. I'm not going to mention all the different sources, just briefly. There's a fascinating autobiography from a lady, Pauline Weingroff. What's significant is her father was Rabbi Yehuda Epstein, and he wrote a sefer, Minchas Yehuda, amazing sefer on Shas, and he learned in Volozhin, and he learned, besides learning in Volozhin, for a period of time, he also learned Shas, Be'iyun, with the Nachlas David Talmud Muvik of Chaim Volozhin. This sefer has fascinating information about the world of Lita. And this daughter of his wrote autobiography many years later. In 1912, it's published in German. Anyway, she starts talking about the Seder, and towards the end, she says, basically, they would pour the cup, a large silver goblet was filled. This is a translation from German. In the middle, it was put aside in the middle of the table for Prophet Eliyahu. And she gives a reason behind it, similar to some of the reasons that we'll see later on. And then she says like this: we children firmly believed in the popular tradition that the prophet Eliyahu came unseen and took a sip from the cup. Without moving a muscle, we stared at the cup to see if it would move, and we were convinced that he was present, and that got us scared. Then afterwards, all the cups were then filled, and then the father, this Chashav Talmud Chacham, would instruct the servant to open the door, and then we would begin to say Shefoch Chamsocha, etc., etc., and that's it. Now, interestingly enough, in some of the translations of this autobiography, they took out this whole passage. I have no idea why not. One other source, and then we'll move on to we'll start moving much faster, is in 1831. It seems there was in Vilna, there was some type of gzeira, and it was affecting the Beis HaKfaris. They wanted to destroy the Beis HaKfaris and stuff like that. And the Yidden were very sad about it. They couldn't do anything about it. Anyway, it seems they were going to destroy even more at a certain point in time, right around Pesach time. And these people come at night they were going to destroy even more parts of this Beis HaKfaris. All of a sudden, someone dressed in white who lived right near the Beis HaKfaris opens up the door. He was wearing his kittel, and he starts saying Baruch haba, because he was being mazmin who Eliyahu Navi before he drinks his kais. And these kids, they saw this guy, they got all scared. He was right near, I guess, Beis HaKfaris, so they were assuming it's a ghost. I don't know, whatever. They ran, and in short, the gzeira of destroying the Beis of this Beis HaKfaris was shut down, so to speak. So, okay, this is a cute story. This is a legend that they would say in Vilna in 1831. Fine, whatever you could take from this. Anyway, okay. Now we move on to further into this story.
Fine. So, Mr. Shem, you're going to give your history of ghosts throughout the ages, right?
That's a different episode. One day.
Yeah, one day. Looking for a sponsor. Ghosts throughout the ages in the Talmud.
No, after the Talmud. After the Talmud. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
After the Talmud. Fine. So you brought us until 1831. What happens between 1831 and the 1980s? Anything happen between then, and what happens in the 1980s?
Okay, so interestingly enough, we're going to jump first. We'll go backwards. We're going to go, you said 1980. So I said you always have to judge a person based on the sources they have. In the 1984, Mechon Yerushalayim had a project called Mifel Teiras Chachmei Ashkenaz, which still from time to time does release material relating to Ashkenaz. And they printed a book. Originally was printed in their journal Ma'ariya, eventually in a sefer from Zalman Binga. And who was he? He's a Talmud of the Maharal, an anical of Menachem Tziuni, which we actually mentioned recently in the Saita episode. This Rav Binga dies when in 1471. In his sefer, here becomes, we now have the earliest source for Kos Shel Eliyahu. And he says that there's a minig that some people have, that they pour a big kais, a kais miyuchid, put it in the table, and they call it Eliyahu. And he says, V'lo yadati ma'in zehatam. Then he suggests maybe it has to do with, because if Eliyahu Navi is going to come, he needs to have cups of wine. And we're mechake that Eliyahu Navi should come Leila Seder. So you have, and we know Afila Ani Shabi Yisrael says in the Mishnah in Arvei Pesachim, you're not supposed to have less than 4 kaises. So he has to have a kais muchan. So we have this cup at the table. So he says he's just trying to come up with a reason, and he suggests this possible reason, but not that is the reason. And also we see that what's important is taka. We don't see in Rishayim beforehand any mention of such a thing called Kos Shel Eliyahu. So here, this might be in his time it started, whatever that means. Also, that obviously needs to be explored in general when you find such a thing with minhagim. Anyway, 1988 comes around, and Mechon Yerushalayim puts out something called Minhagim of Vermaiza from Rabbi Yosef Shemesh, and he also talks about that they will prepare. And from here, it sounds like that there's going to be a special guest, and they would prepare a Kos Shel Eliyahu Navi for this guest, who we're always waiting for him to come. Now, this guest and this Rabbi Yosef Shemesh, we're going to return to in a few minutes. What else he says in his piece. But that's another source. So here we have another source about it, and this is also an earlier source. The last source that I'm going to mention over here is that Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote Ha'aris on the Pesach Mu'uvin of the Knesset Hagadah, which we quoted earlier. So we already mentioned that Rabbi Yaakov Emden likes the minig. He says that they did this minig, but he says that they would pour in the shiur, the leftover kaisis, that he's against. You're not supposed to drink from something that someone else drank from. But the etzem minig to prepare a big kais for kavod of Eliyahu, this, he says, bevadai kiblu kein me'akedoshim b'doira melame kibnei neviim heim. So there must be a source for it. Okay, similar to what we said, Moshe Chagiz says that minig Yisrael Tairi. Okay, one last source just to throw out there. We're talking about new sources. So in recent years, Chuvas Rebbe Kiva Yosef Schlesinger, very interesting material. So he also, it's published from manuscript, and this also has a tshuva on the topic. Fine. Okay, now let's get further on into our story, and it's as follows. I mentioned that one of the sources that we to use for minhagim in general, and minhagim that you don't find in the Noisei Kelim Shulchan Aruch, you have to try to look, is in autobiographical accounts and accounts of people that went off the derech. So there's one such person over here, we'll call him Margarita, but his first name was I'm going to forget it. I'm not going to break my teeth on his first name. But anyway, the point is like this. He's the son of a Chashuv Gadol at the time, a Yakish Rav, Rabbi Yaakov Margolis. And he writes an attack on Yiddishkeit after he goes off to derech and becomes a Christian in the 1530s. And he's referring to Leil HaSeder. He talks about what happens by Shefoch Chamsocha, which he says, why was Shefoch Chamsocha to curse out the Goyim? And then they open up the door, and then someone comes into the room, as if dressed up, as if he's Eliyahu Navi, that he's coming to say that Mashiach's coming, and he says they're being mezalzel in Mashiach and Eliyahu Navi. They're making a joke from this. This is what he says in 1530. So we see over here that what's interesting is here we're having 1530. This is an early date, earlier than almost all the sources, and there's something about opening the door, Eliyahu coming to visit. Okay, but this does not tie into Kos Shel Eliyahu. Interestingly enough, a different Yakisha sefer that was only published in the 1720s, but the author was a dayan on the Bezdin of the Shla. We've quoted him in the past in different episodes. It was Rabbi Yosef Yusfa, author of the Yosef Eimitz. So he says, by what did they do? By Shefoch Chamsocha. Yaffe, how nice is Zecher Mashiach that someone, when they would open the door, someone would come in dressed up like Eliyahu Navi, and he's praising the minig. Why are we doing this? To remind us, and that we believe that Mashiach, he's giving a whole different spin than this son of Yaakov Margolis. Interestingly enough, it's sort of like some people say it's more like just to get the kids awake, keep them awake, to surprise them, to make it interesting for them. This is also what's behind it. And there's a lot of sources for doing such things during the Seder, all different types of things, which is a different share to discuss, the different minhagim that we do to keep the kids into it. But interestingly enough, not only is this this Christian fellow, or who was a Meshumid actually, against this minig, but the Makar Chaim writes this, that they have someone dress up and everything. It's a pritzusa v'chuka. Okay, now let's move on into this to the next topic, which relates to what we just said.
Makar Chaim, the Nesirus
No.
HaMishpat,
No, interestingly not. Sorry, because I should have spelled it out. A lot of people always say that. This is Makar Chaim of Rabbi Yair Bachrach, author of the Chavas Yair. So this is also a sefer that was only published in the 1980s from manuscript, an incredible sefer in Archaim. Okay. Now, moving on, which continues, which relates to this last thing, which is that at Shefoch Chamsocha, Eliyahu Navi and kids and seeing stuff is like this. Various people have pointed, and I'm not going to give the long list, but Yehuda Avidah is amongst them, point to, if you look at Jewish art, which we spoke about a little bit at the end of the episode that we gave last year on Hagadah Shel Pesach, that there's many Haggadahs that which have pictures, this picture Haggadahs, and we throughout the ages, and not only that, we now know in the times of the Rishonim, there's manuscript Haggadahs that are full of illustrations, and the question is, what are they for, and who is the audience? So obviously, a Pasha Pshat is, it was to, it would seem that it was to get the kids into it. They had pictures. Pictures today, we know all about comics and everything. I'm saying there's all different types of Haggadahs from all different companies currently today. I believe Koren has a Haggadah, but not, a recent Haggadah, but there's dozens of Haggadahs with pictures, and the point is to engage the children. So early on, already they've been doing this. Now, and in the beginning of print, they've been doing this. So there's illustrations in Haggadahs, and a lot could be learned from these illustrations. But for our purposes, by Shefoch Chamsocha, many of the pictures you'll see around Shefoch Chamsocha is a picture of a donkey, an Eliyahu, someone looks like Eliyahu Navi, and a Shefer. So the connection's obvious. There's some type of thing, some type of connection between Mashiach, Eliyahu Navi, and the donkey that's taking place at Shefoch Chamsocha. Now, but that does not interpret, there's no picture of a kite in almost all these Haggadahs, there's no picture of a Kos Shel Eliyahu, but Shefoch Chamsocha, and that we're opening the door and we're inviting him in, or as even Rabbi Yosef, the Yosef Aimitz, when he's talking about it, it's someone's coming in, it's Eliyahu Navi to remind, so you see there's some type of thing going on with Eliyahu Navi coming to the actual Seder. Okay. Now, and this goes, as I said, you can find this in pictures going back to the Middle Ages, even before print. Fine. So we have some type of makar in numerous paintings and art that Eliyahu Navi does actually come to the Seder, it sounds like. Okay. Back to, I mentioned that an early source is Rabbi Yosef Yusuf Shemesh in Minhagim of Vermaiza. He talks about this minig, and he says that they would prepare a kais. Then he says an interesting thing. He says, Mazikim, when you say the name Eliyahu Navi, Mazikim go away. Then he says as follows. When you're opening up the door by Shefoch Chamsocha and people say Eliyahu Navi and Mashiach is going to come, so we want to chase away the Mazikim, so we say Eliyahu Navi's name. Then he says as follows. Some places have Litzayer Mashiach Eliyahu. They have pictures of Mashiach and Eliyahu. Why? For the children. But he says as follows. Not to tell them that Eliyahu Navi comes, but rather, they're going to see the picture, they're going to say the name Eliyahu. So this is a whole new different picture in all those illustrations that you see. It's not because Eliyahu Navi is really coming and everything, which there is Makairis for it, as we said, from the Yosef Aimitz and others. But that he's saying is, it's just a skula to protect us from Mazikim. And as a matter of fact, there's different reasons which we're going to get to. Why do we open up the door on the Leila Seder? When we so one of the reasons that of the many different reasons that's given, let me see if I can find this right now. Yeah, we open up the door because in early ages there were people that there would be always malshinim on Jews, and that they're cursing the Melech and the Goyim. So we open up the door to say that chas v'shalom we're not referring to this. we're doing this b'shalom. But then there's a different reason. Some people say it was they opening up the doors because there's always the famous stories that people grow up with, that there would be a blood libel, and they would open up the door and they discover it. So it has to do with that. But anyway, but the point that the point over here is as follows, and to conclude with this piece is as follows. Even though one could say you have the art and it shows pictures of Eliyahu Navi and Mashiach, or something looking like a Mashiach, and a Chamar and a Shofar, and that's what you interpret, it's rather just to, when you're opening up the door, it's to chase away Mazikim. Okay, but this gets us to the next question, and that is, where does the minig of opening up the door come from? So interestingly enough, the Ramah brings this down. It seems his Makar is Mem Hey Reish Yud Beis. In general, that abbreviation stands for B'Yisrael Bruna, that there's a minig, by Shefoch Chamsocha, you open up the door. What's this have to do with? Because it's Leil Shimurim, and we don't have doors open. So Dafke Shefoch Chamsocha, you open up the door. Okay, so but over there it says in the Makar of the Arzua, v'zeh our belief b'Hakadosh Baruch Hu, u'b'schus haftacha zu an nigalim l'zeh paischim b'shveich hadeles, b'shveich hadeles. By during Shefoch Chamsocha we open up the door. Kiloymer al yidei zeh roi levay Mashiach. The Mashiach should be right to come, and this is brought down the Ramah and the Levush, Matei Moshe, and others. Where's the Makar for this? So it's the Arzarua. And earlier, Reb Nissen Gaon and other Makayers and Gaonim, that they would open the door. Now, interestingly enough, in certain nuskais of this, l'mashal in the Sefer HaManig, it says that you wouldn't have the door. You wouldn't have the door when you go to sleep at night. You'd make sure to leave open the door, which is a whole parsha in halacha about it. But it says V'im Yaffe Eliyahu yimtza habayis patuach. The point is that he should find the door open. So this is again something to do with that Eliyahu Navi is actually coming to the Leil HaSeder. Anyway, to just get moving over here is as follows. L'mashal, there's the Hafla's son in his incredible drush sefer Lachmi Taida. He's giving a musar to his kihila, and he's saying, all these rich people, they don't invite guests. And he says in the beginning of the seder, what do? They make sure the door is locked. It's Leil Shimurim, but they don't want to bring in aniyim. And when you say Kol Dichon Yetziv V'Yechel, they're really lying. And also, Kishemagim L'Shveich Chamsocha, then suddenly they open the door, B'Shvil Kavod Eliyahu Navi, to come into the house. So we see already in the early 1800s such a minig that they opened the door so that Eliyahu Navi could come in. Now, everyone grew up with stories of different gedolim that they had Eliyahu Navi come to the Seder. L'mashal, there's the famous Tyrus Chesed, the Gvaldik Tshuva Sefer. He didn't let anyone come to his Seder. And they say why? Because Eliyahu Navi would come and he didn't want anyone else to be there. Okay. Remendel Zaks writes about the Seder of the Chavetz Chaim that he was able to, from the story that he asked Chavetz Chaim something, he was able to understand that who was at the Seder, none other than Eliyahu Navi. Okay, there's another story, Lamashal, the Belzer Rebbe, such a thing, and there's many stories in the Hasidic literature and other stories that Eliyahu Navi came. Interestingly enough, there's much earlier sources for such a thing, that Eliyahu Navi Taka comes to the Leil HaSeder, and that's as follows. There's a story with Rabbi Yehuda Chassid that it's brought now. This from the 1300s and onwards, numerous stories of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid became famous, and the way they would become famous, they were told over through different venues, and they were published in Hebrew and in Yiddish and in different places. So I'm just going to one such story was that there was a Yid, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Shneier, in the same place, in the same city of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. And B'Kitzer, the point was that at Leil Pesach, when they got up to Kilei Noeh, he saw that Rabbi Yehuda Chassid was very happy. B'Kitzer, he asked him why, and he said, because Eliyahu Navi is with us. He was with us. So he says, I wasn't Zecher to see him. This other person says. He says, no, don't worry, Eliyahu Navi was standing closer to you than to me. But the point was that here we have Eliyahu Navi coming to the Leil HaSeder, to the Seder of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid. And this was a source going back hundreds of years, such a story, that there was such a story. And as we know, till today, when it opens up all the numerous Haggadahs, you'll always find such stories with different great Gedolim that Eliyahu Navi actually visited. Now, what's the reasoning behind this? So Moshe Chagiz, who I told you in the original, I mentioned earlier, he ties this into that just like there's a minig of Kos Shel Eliyahu, where Eliyahu Navi comes, he connects that somehow that we show we're doing the carbon Pesach properly. This was the original time when Eliyahu Navi would come, even then, and that's why we say Damei Chayi, which is referring to Dam Mila and Dam Pesach, and this is the Shvach of Klal Yisrael, that an Eliyahu Navi comes to witness that we're all doing the mitzvahs properly. This is what Moshe Chagiz says more barichos about it. Okay, fine. Now, veering away from this topic for a minute of Eliyahu Navi in this aspect, a completely different, interesting Maharal to explain what's going on behind the Kos Shel Eliyahu, and this can be found in Gimple Yaffe, a great Talmud of the Volozhin Yeshiva from Yitzchak Volozhin, great Gaon. He says it's really has to do with Zecher LeChurban. And to remind us that who's going to be the guy who we always find in halacha, you're supposed to have things Zecher LeChurban, even at a suda you're supposed to do different things. So everything at the seder is gevaldik, but there's an important factor you have to remember: Zecher LeChurban of what was of the churban that were the Beis Hamikdash and the carbon Pesach and all that, and that's why we have this Kos Shel Eliyahu, who's going to be the person that's going to be goyel us. And that's why we say Udafka by Shefoch Chamsocha. Okay, this is where Mordechai Gimple Yaffe, his son-in-law, brings this down in his book, his small little book that he published, that was just recently published on this Mordechai Gimple Yaffe, and he was Bechlal very concerned in various things about Zecher LeChurban, this Mordechai Gimple Yaffe, and he ends up making Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. This is a different story. Anyway, fine. So at this point where we have mentioned various reasons, and now I would just like to mention one more famous reason, which you alluded to all the way in the beginning, and then conclude with 2 or 3 other very short points, and that's as follows. Up till now, we still don't have a good makar of where is it coming from. Okay, so in 1905. There was a Yid, Rabbi Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg, who prints from manuscript Hagadah Shel Pesach, and he says it's Hagadah Shel Pesach of the Maharal, and it has 2 perushim. One's called Lashon Limudim, and one's called Divrei Negidim. And he says this is Xavier from a son-in-law of the Maharal. Okay, this Hagadah is published instantly numerous times. Okay, he says, interestingly enough, in his introduction, this is a kitzur of the Maharal's Gevuras Hashem, and it has Dvarim Chadashim. But he doesn't say what these Dvarim Chadashim are. Anyway, when you open up the Hagadah by Shefoch Chamsocha, he says he ties in Mamish Psichas to open the door with Eliyahu Navi, and that's why we pour a kais Kos Shel Eliyahu to show to Bnei Beisai Shagula Shleima Tali B'Bias Hagal Tzedek, and that's why. This is quoting the Maharal, Al Pitam Zeh Nagti, Loimer Beis Psichas Hadeles, I say Tfilas Harachman, Mapsukam Mayrim Alinin Zeh. Now, then he has Arichos about the Sugya in Gemara. If one should have 4 cases or 5 cases, then he brings down that you should. It's a school for Parnasa, and the Kos Shel Eliyahu, he ties it into Eliyahu Navi coming to the bris, and Shefoch Chamsocha Dafka over now, that he's the Malach of Shefa Bracha. Okay, so B'kitzur, we have over here someone tying everything that you want tied together, beautifully tied together, and none other than who? This is the Maharal. The Maharal in this Hagadah published in 1905. Okay, so then we have, it's amazing. Now, because we're tying in a Sugya Psachim. Now, what's the Sugya Psachim? So just to mention, the Sugya Psachim says, one line from it talks about Taner Rabbanan Revi Gomer Lov it's a Halal. The 4th cup you say Halal Vaymer Halal Hagal Divrei Tarfin, and this is the Girsa, but there's another Girsa, which is Chamishi Omer Lov it's a Halal Hagal Divrei Tarfin, meaning to say that there's a 4th cup, and numerous manuscripts show this, and Ga'inim and Rishainim, that there's a Makar according to Tarfin. It is a 5th cup, and when is this 5th cup? Around this period of time at the Seder. And Reb Nachum Kasher ends up writing a whole kuntres documenting the story of the Kos Chamishi. And he comes out with the conclusion that you should drink the Kos Chamishi. And here we have the Maharal, according to this Hagadah, in 1905, pro the Kos Chamishi. But the Maharal is going a step further. He's saying the Kos Chamishi is the Kos of Eliyahu Navi. All the Makairis of the Rishainim and Ga'inim that talk about it, and the Gerson Gemara, they don't talk about a Kos Shel Eliyahu, but they talk about a Kos Chamishi. So here we have the 5th cup, that cup that all these people that we saw already from Reb, from the Shiur, from the Knesset Hagdolah and onwards, that talk about pouring a Kos Shel Eliyahu, It comes out, according to the Maharal, that's what? It's not stam a cup that they were pouring. They were doing the Kos Chamishi. What's interesting is none of those sources say anything about drinking the Kos Chamishi, which is what this sugi is talking about. How does one combine the two? So obviously, it's an issue because this Maharal Hagadah, so to speak, is being miyachas with the Maharal, such a thing, but nowhere else do we find. And you would think this is a topic that everyone talks about. The Rishonim talk about Gainim, and they became on Haga amongst people already early on, without going to the whole list, to have a Kos Chamishi. But no one points out that Kos Chamishi is Eliyahu Navi. But we're going to get to what people say in a minute to talk about it. Earlier than this Maharal. But it turns out this Maharal Hagadah, a lot of people end up using it as a makar. You should be drinking a Kos Chamishi. But it turns out, just like we know the story of the Maharal and the Gailim, which was also published by the same Rabbi Yula Rosenberg, is not true. It's baloney, in plain simple English. And I'm not going to get into explaining the whole story behind it. One could be ma'ayin on the internet, various articles of Professor Shneur Zalman Lyman. And of course, there's going to be people that are going to come and try to bring rayas that really the Maharal did create a Gailim. Seder, that's not the topic. I do remember one year, Rabbi Reisman, his famous Navi shir, years and years ago, he said as a Dover Pashal, he ended off a shir saying that the Maharal Gailim never happened. And people were very upset. What do you mean? I grew up reading the Jewish press, and there's all the stories of the Gailim, so it has to be true. So he got enough people asked him it can't be. So he went, and the next year he gave a 20-minute shir discussing the proofs of that the Maharal's Gailim is not as far as we know from the evidence, not that the Maharal could not have created a Gailim, but the story based on the evidence that we do have is not true. Anyway, so the point is, this Maharal Hagadah, we have the Gvuras Hashem, the Chibur of the Maharal and Hilchos Pesach, which the place can quote, and they had it already right then. He doesn't talk. He has arichos on the sugi of Kos Chamishi. There we don't see. He mentions, by the way, I have this Mordechai thing called Kos Shel Eliyahu, and all this. Suddenly, what's going on over here? Anyway, so as I said, it's accepted by most people, I believe, that the Maharal Hagadah of Rabbi Rosenberg is not authentic. And this whole shtickle Torah is a gewaldig shtickle Torah of his, but it's not the Maharal. Okay. But let's go further. But how does it link to what you were saying? Because now we're holding at the Kos Chamishi. Turns out it does. And that is that like this. Why is it called Kos Shel Eliyahu? Is as follows. Because there's a machlokes in the Gemara if you need 5 cups or 4 cups. So they said, pour a Kos Chamishi. But don't drink it. We call it Kos Shel Eliyahu because Eliyahu Navi is going to come, Bizman of Mashiach, and he's going to tell us what's the real halacha. So that's why it's called Kos Shel Eliyahu. Not because Eliyahu Navi comes to the Leila Seder, but because it's a suffix, and we know who's going to be Paishat all as fake is Teiku, all of the Gemara. So they claim this is from the Vilna Gaon. Most likely the Vilna Gaon did not say it, but it's possible Ephraim Zalman Golis said it. Okay, there's a lot of interesting material about this. I mentioned this. Lord Jacobi wrote about it also. The earliest source it seems from a Chibur 1837 from Barrett Levinson. Interesting person, but we won't go into all the pratim due to lack of time. I want to keep this episode only to one episode. I have Rachmanis on everyone, but the point is that the according to this reason, whoever it is, a chashuv person definitely said this vart, and there's a long list of chashuv people. Just to mention Rabbi Yochanan Fisher Perlau, he seems to say it also, and I collected a list of, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 people that say different aspects of this vart. They also tied into another nakuda, which is as follows. We said you're opening up the door, and the door also ties into, we know, what's going on? You're opening up the door, but didn't we say in the beginning of the Seder called the Chanyetz of Yechel? So why are you opening the door all of a sudden at the end? So the answer is because in the Gemara there's a dion. We only have arba kaisis. Why? Because we're the chash of zugos. So we only do things in pairs. So one of the but I leil shimurim. So you say. So it's because it's Leil Shimurim, there might be a reason why one can not have to worry about it, and he would be able to have a 5th kais. So this is also a suffix that again would be in certain versions of this piece of Torah with Eliyahu Navi being Paishet is also in the sugi of Zugos, and this is found the Zugos aspect with the opening of the doors in the Beis Halevi. Okay, anyway, so what comes out is. What's Nagel in Yonenu is that we don't have we don't have a clear exact definition from all this material when exactly is it happening, and when and what exactly is it behind, because according to all this has nothing to do with all the material that I quoted in the beginning, and this is because nothing to do with Eliyahu Navi coming to the Seder Taka. Okay, now, but let's just conclude with two very short points, and then we'll conclude with one last question, and that's as follows. Number one, as I mentioned again a few times, this Rabbi Yehuda Avidah, he prints this kuntris, and he brings down the Moshe Chagiz, which I quoted earlier, says that some people would sleep the whole night next to the Kos Shel Eliyahu, but Avidah doesn't know why. Then he suggests it has to do with the similar to the Nakuda of we unlock the door to show we eagerly await Eliyahu and Mashiach's arrival, and then he says like this: maybe there's a Leked Yosher from the Trumas Hadeshins, the Talmud recording what the Trumas Hadeshin did. He would sleep on a bed that he learned on during the meal. He doesn't know what the reason for is. Says Rabbi Avidah, could be that he was sleeping there to remind himself of this concept. On Pesach night, we are eagerly awaiting Mashiach. And that's one of the nakudas of this whole thing. It's not about if Eliyahu Navi does come and the kids are looking if he's drinking and everything. What keeps on coming across is that on the Leila Seder, and this refers to the Vehivesi actually, we're supposed to be thinking about the future. And this is clear in the Mekairis of the Rishayim and the Ga'inim about opening the door, that this is a night that Eliyahu Navi technically could come, and we want him to come. We're praying that he should come. Okay. Anyway, the Lekuti Chaver from the Talmud of Cham Sofer, he also would mention that the Cham Sofer would keep the cup the entire night, and he would use it for when? The Kiddush the next morning. This would seem to be some type of connection with what the Trumas Hadesh and possibly according to Rabbi Yehuda Avidah's connection is. Okay, one last issue over here, halachic, is a tshuva from Reb Shimon Falk, where he asks, there's a halacha, you can't bring a full loaf of bread on the table before benching. Why? Because it looks like it's some type of Avodah Zarah. This is a whole sugya in itself, and it's in Archaim. There's a Simon Shulchan Aruch about it. The Magen Avram, Knesset Gdoli, they all talk about it. So what's pshat? Why could we prepare a glass of Kos Shel Eliyahu and not have to worry about this chash? So he says it could be that was only a time in the time. That's why we don't find in the Gemara such a thing, because in the times of the Gemara there was such a chash to leave a kais or a whole lechem because it was a people over there Avodah Zarah. But today we're not amongst Goyim who worship in Nazah Eifin. So Mamela, that's how come today there's a Kos Shel Eliyahu, not as opposed to earlier sources. Okay, now I'd like to conclude with one last nekuda, and that is as follows. Eliyahu Navi, we're talking all about Eliyahu Navi, and this is a question, again, that some cynical people ask, and we'll see one such cynical person in a moment. How does Eliyahu Navi come to so many sedarim? Not only that, some people say if he's drinking so much wine, he's drunk. Okay, there's a different question I've seen brought down recently. He might have been a Nazir, so how are we even putting out the wine for him? Okay, anyway, there was a Yid, a terrible, evil Yid, and we're not going to get into his story, but his name was Yaakov Frank. We have his autobiographical accounts, and this is in the 1650s. He's writing as a kid. They would do the Kos Shel Eliyahu in his house. Okay, and then he says like this, but he asked, how could people believe in such a thing, that you believe that he's coming to so many houses? He could go to so many houses and drink so many cups of wine. Anyway, it seems that people were bothered by such a question. So just to address this as follows. The Rekeach says, Eliyahu Zecher L'Tov has many shlichim. So let's say when there's a bris milah on Shabbos, he has to be in a bunch of places. And furthermore, there's tchumen milamayla. He has shlichim lamata. He has malachim that he sends to all different places, and they could go everywhere. And that's how it works. It's not that Eliyahu Navi himself is coming; it's through shlichim of malachim. Okay, this is above my pay grade, but there's a state in the Rekeach and various makayos. It seems by Eliyahu Navi, people were very bothered by this, because by Eliyahu Navi by bris milah, because as I said, Eliyahu Navi comes to every bris. How can it be by every bris? Even though obviously Leila say that there's more happening at once, and he has to synchronize the timing. So there's a Sefer Nitzachon written in the early 1400s that he also talks about. He says, I understand. We believe that the Malach HaMaves could kill someone more than one person at the same time. So we see there's a concept, obviously. So he says it's not such a kasha, but he was writing the Skiba Sefer Nitzachon because this is what people said. And Professor Daniel Lasker has a whole article documenting different aspects with this Nakuda with the Sefer Nitzachon. And I saw Interestingly enough, in a Chibur Ir Vilna, a fascinating sefer on Vilna, so volume 2 came out from manuscript a few years ago. So in the newspapers in Carmel in the 1850s, 1860s, I believe it was, this was a subject that many people, that a few people wrote in. I did not collect the articles yet, what they say, but basically, how could it be that Eliyahu is at a bunch of places? Anyway, so this is just a te'ima, a brief discussion of what lies behind the cut for the visitor, Eliyahu Navi, and this is just some of the nukudis that one could find if one researches the topic. But obviously, is Torah Zain L'Davar Saif, and one's more than welcome to jump into the rabbit hole with me and continue to journey and see what many more people say about it. But that's for a different time.
Thank you very much. Once again, would like to thank the sponsor, a friend of Rabbi Moshe Chagiz. Go out, get yourself the Minchas Chinuch on Pesach, 2 volumes. You'll see a fascinating sefer. I've already seen it. And it's with the Minchas Chinuch style, and really beautiful to enhance understanding the various mitzvahs that we do on Pesach. Rabbi Brot, thank you. This was really, really fascinating. Again, if anybody would like access to some of the PDFs that Rabbi Brot mentioned, please email him, eliezerbrot@gmail.com. Questions, suggestions, critique, and everything, all welcome. Any language. To Rabbi Brot or myself, Moshe Shwed. My email address is shwedm@ou.org. Everybody should have themselves a wonderful day.